Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. This is a special session here at EuroVis of papers from the journals Computers and Graphics and its open access sister, Graphics and Visual Computing. This session came to be based on a special agreement between Elsevier, the publisher, and EuroVis, for which we thank, in particular, EuroVis allowing us to do this. And the intention is, like with many of these kinds of agreements, to give a bit better visibility to journal publications that have not yet been presented at some conferences. The process that we followed for this first edition of this special session is that the editorial board members who worked with submissions in the visualization area suggested these papers, and then collected a number of them. And the requirement was, of course, that the paper had not been presented previously. And then we looked at these, saw if these are adequate, and if so, offered this presentation to the authors. And from the sets of papers that we looked at from about the last year in the journals, 5 groups of authors accepted. All the papers in the session today will in fact be openly accessible on Elsevier's digital library for the coming 6 months. And if you look at the program of EuroVis, you will see the links so that you can get directly to the papers if you're interested in reading more about these. So we have 5 exciting talks coming up, so I don't want to waste too much more time. Just as a note, if you have questions about any of these presentations, please ask these questions right away in the different chats, and we will see them here, and then we have them ready for the Q&A session. We have about 20-minute slots, so about 50 minutes for the talks, and then 5 for questions. So without further ado, let's get started with the first presentation, which is given by Yngve Kristiansen from the University of Bergen.
Hi, I'm Yngve as Kristiansen, and I'm with the University of Bergen, and I'll be presenting Visception, an interactive visual framework for nested visualization design. So what is a nested visualization? Well, it is when one chart is embedded into another. So in this example, we see within each circle, we have both a bar chart and a donut chart. Another example is the New York Times at the national conventions, the words they used. It was published in 2012, and it shows which words were mentioned the most by which political parties. And we see this ratio between how many mentions. We see it both in text, but we also see it in that it is nested within each circle. And that makes it a really good visualization. It makes it really, really clear. So how is this visualization made? We see it's written in D3 code. And this is actually quite low level and quite tedious, especially for non-experts. But there are easier ways to write visualizations. And one example is Vega, where you can specify visualization declaratively. However, such general grammars cannot express these nested visualizations at a general level. And then there are special grammars for expressing specific kinds of visualizations. For example, Atom is a grammar of unit visualizations, where one row in the dataset is represented by a graphical mark. And product plots is a grammar of area plots that allows you to combine these charts like we see in this picture here. However, these specialized grammars cannot express nested, highly customized visualizations at a general level. And there are also visual builders for creating visualizations without having to write code. For example, Charticulator makes it possible to express bespoke, reusable chart layouts. And Data Illustrator makes it possible to specify graphics and then bind data to it. And these builders are highly expressive, but no builders are able to express nested visualizations at a general level. So that's where the research gap is. So suppose we have this example by the New York Times, a stacked bar chart, unit visualization, the best bookshelf visualization, and there's other like stream graphs nested within circles. What would be a framework or builder that could express all these things? We address this research gap by making nesting a first-class operation, meaning that we make all charts nestable and we see where that leads us. So our contribution consists of roughly 3 parts. We begin by just defining a chart and its channels, and then we put them into a tree of charts, which we dub a VC tree. And then we create a visual builder that allows you to create and edit these VC trees and see the resulting visualization in real time. So a single chart, it takes some tabular input data and it turns it into some output data objects, and then the objects are then again turned into graphical elements. So for example, if we have this table with 3 distinct hair colors, red, brown and black, if we group by hair color, we get 3 data objects. And correspondingly, this would map to, for example, 3 circles. Each chart has a set of channels, and the channels control the appearance of its graphical marks, but also related elements. So for example, the labels. So consider this one bar chart with no mappings. So one example of a channel would be the bar height. If it's mapped to something, the bars will be varying. And there's also channels that aren't mappable to anything, but still edit the shapes. For example, the bar padding edits the spacing between the bars. And we separate between 2 kinds of channels. So first we have layout channels. And layout channels, they directly affect the marks. So they affect the shape or position of the output marks. And they're usually specific to a particular chart. For example, if we have this bar chart here, then the bar height channel is clearly a layout channel because there must be bars for there to be a bar height channel, and not all charts have bars. And then there are style channels, and that's stuff like stroke or the drop shadow or a fill, and they are general for all charts. So for example, the fill color is a style channel. And this distinction is actually useful because with layout channels we can specify layout channel equivalences across charts. And that lets us change the chart type and also preserve the mappings. So consider these different visual representations. They're all showing the same data, but it's possible to toggle between these representations with the equivalences. So everything that's needed to go from one of these representations to the other is to simply change the chart type. And channels are sometimes mappable to parent data. And I'll explain what that means with an example. So here we have a bar chart with some circles nested inside it, and each bar represents a data object. And similarly, each circle also represents a data object. Now consider this bar chart where the circles inside are actually red. So the fill color channel is mapped to something. And in this case, the fill color channel is mapped to the data. But what if it could be mapped to the parent data? Well, that would look like this. So now all the circles are colored the same if they are inside the same parent. So we have the fill color channel, it's mapped to something, and we have the data items, but also here's the parent data. So in this case, the fill color channel of the circles is mapped to the parent data. So now we have defined an individual chart, and now we're going to put them into a hierarchy, a Visception tree, which is a tree structure where each node encapsulates a single chart. So in these 2 examples, we see some hierarchies of charts. Here we see inside each circle, there's a bar chart and a donut chart. And here we see that the node here that's colored red corresponds to all the bars with a red stroke. And then we see each bar there again has another bar chart nested within it. And there are some operations that can be done to this tree, and we'll go through them one by one. So the nest operation is to put one chart inside another chart. So visually, if we have this chart before, circle within circle, if we nest this other chart and it happens to be a bar chart, then we will get the bar chart inside each of the inner circles. And on the tree, it corresponds to adding a new node, dropping a node beneath an existing node, and then the new hierarchy will, in this case, look like this. The group operation is where you group a chart by another chart. So if we begin with a single bar chart and we group it by a chart which happens to be these three circles, then instead of then having one bar chart, we'll have a bar chart inside each circle. And it corresponds to the thing you would do in SQL, like the group by. And visually in the VC tree, this is achieved by simply dropping a node above the existing node, and this then creates the hierarchy. And then we have two operations, layer front and layer back. And layer front is when a node is dropped on the left side of a target node. So this is the target node. And then it is then turned into the left neighbor of that node in the hierarchy. And since it is the left neighbor, its resulting chart will be rendered on top of the chart corresponding to the target node. And conversely, if it's dropped on the right hand side, it becomes the right neighbor, and then it is instead rendered beneath. And finally, it's possible to delete a node from the hierarchy, which also removes the resulting visualization. So for example, here we have circles and then a bar chart inside it. If we delete the node for the bar chart, it also removes the bar charts, and then we just have circles. So now we've established there's a hierarchy of charts, and now we're going to talk about how the data mappings are resolved for a single node in a Visception tree. So we begin by saying that a node has a data mapping and some input data and some output data. And if the node is a root node, so the one highlighted here is a root node, its input data is all the rows in the data set. So the input data is a single data object holding all the rows in the data set. And the data mapping transforms the input data, which in this case, a single data object with all the rows in the data set, it transforms it into output data, which in this case is 4 new data objects. And correspondingly, there are 4 output marks. And the way the mapping is done, the most common kind of mapping would be an aggregation, aggregate by a certain column, like a group by a certain column. But there are other mappings, like you could want one output data object per selected data attribute, for example, or for a selected set of data attributes, or you might only want one, or you might want one per row. And the output data of a VC node, so in this case the root node, is the input data of its child nodes. In this case, this node here, that's the child node. We'll now go through how the geometric aspect of nesting is resolved per node. And we do this by defining that each node has 2 spaces. First, there is a layout space, and that's a space where the shapes are computed and it is normalized. And then afterwards, the shapes are rendered into a parent space. And if the node is a root node, then the parent space is the viewport or canvas. So for example here, now we see the root node is highlighted, and we see the marks, the root marks, these gray outer circles are highlighted. So then the parent space is the viewport canvas. Otherwise, the parent spaces are within the output marks of its parent node. So if we consider this node here, the highlighted one, composite 3, which is the leaf node, then the parent node is this node here right above. And then this right here, these white squares, these make up the parent spaces. And when the shapes are computed in the layout space and transformed so they can be rendered in the parent space, between there is a transformation. And that transformation is specified differently for each chart, and it depends on the specified layout behavior. So there are three ways this can be done. The first way is the shapes can be deformed. So here we see at the leaf chart, it's actually a bar chart. So these are, the geometry here is just rectangles, but since they are nested within a pie chart, we see that these rectangles are actually turned into arcs. And then we have the undeformed transformation. So if we look at the leaf chart right here, we see it starts out as rectangles and afterwards it is transformed, but it's still rectangles, so they are not deformed. And finally, the shapes can also be fitted into the existing shapes, and this is useful when you want the shapes to retain the same basic shape, but you want to just fit them inside. So for example, here we see we have these pie charts within other pie charts, and this makes sense when you want to just fit them, and it would not make sense to transform these charts point by point. Our visual builder makes the expressiveness of the VC tree and all its behaviors available to the user. The easiest way to demonstrate this is by seeing it in action. Here we see the initial view when a dataset is selected. On the right, we see the data view from which data attributes can be dragged. Now we drag the word attribute and drop it on the canvas. This creates a chart grouped by word, meaning one circle per word. Now we see two more views appear. The channels view for modifying individual channels and the outline view for modifying the hierarchy. Now we start dragging the sum of mentions and drop it to the size channel. Next we drag the percentage trump and drop it on the X position channel. Now we will do some nesting. We drop the name column under the existing chart, which creates a new chart inside each circle. We now select this newly created chart and change the chart type to columns. Then we drag some mentions to the bar width channel. And then we drag the name to the fill color channel. And now we make the circle effect by doing two things. One, we use the bounce channel to stretch the bars out so they cover their parent marks. And two, we enable the clip channel so that they are now circles. We now do some edits to individual channels just to get the style into place. And we've now demonstrated how the New York Times example can be recreated in just a few simple steps. To demonstrate the viability of our system, we generated many examples, and I will briefly show some of them. Here we see gun crime broken down by intent, sex, age, and race. We also recreated Nightingale's rows with a simple hierarchy, and there are many other examples that can be seen in the paper. So to wrap this up, we have now demonstrated how a VC tree can be used to represent a nested visualization and how it can be made available and editable to users via a visual builder. And with this builder, we have generated many results that demonstrate the expressiveness of this approach. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Yngve, for this very nice presentation. Please, everyone, if you have questions, type them into the chat as soon as possible so that I can see it and I can ask these questions. Otherwise, I will just start with one or two of my own. Yngve, this was very interesting, but I was wondering about the specific audience of your grammar. I assume this is mostly intended or targeted at visualization researchers. And the question would be, how would you extend that to non-researchers, and maybe connected also, what's the target application specifically? Is it the understanding of the nesting, or is it more the actual creation or construction of visual representations?
So initially it was just for like mostly research purpose, because it's like very specific visualizations. For example, we had some, like, we can't show the data set, but we had someone, for example, measuring like concentrations of minerals at different sea levels over time. And there, this program was very like suited for creating such visualizations. But an initial goal was also just to make something that also novice users could use. But it was also like very challenging to somehow make this possible to do without, you know, having to understand these things like data aggregation and things like that.
One other thing that I was wondering, since I don't see any questions coming up in the chat yet, is there any guidance, or did you plan any guidance for people about less than ideal or non-usable mappings? Because of course some won't really be perfect or ideal in this case. Some sort of design guidelines in the trees.
We did not address this, but if I just understood your question right, like sort of preventing people from making very overloaded, too much information designs. Yeah, I believe this would be a bit like outside the scope of this program.
Sure, I mean, this is, I'm not saying that you should have done that. I'm just asking that would be like a next step that I would have
it would be a nice thing to have, yes, very nice thing to have.
All right, there's one more question that came up from Michael Upeti. He says, in the demo, when clipping a rectangle stacked area chart by a circle parent, can you also maintain the actual area ratio in the clip part so that the visible area matches the proportions?
In this case, I actually checked in the D3 code. If I remember right, like they did this actually the same thing with the clipping. So it is kind of an approximation because the area ratios are not preserved. So what you're seeing is more, you know, the same ratio, but it's clipped. So the area ratios get a little bit distorted by this.
And the final question, have you done any user studies, even though the visualization is targeted at visualization experts? Have you any experience of how non-experts would use that?
Like sort of on the record user studies, no. The closest thing would be where we met with some, I think it was like marine biologists, and they needed this visualization, and we kind of used it in a guided fashion, but there they more said like what they wanted, and then we did it for them quite fast. But we did not get to do that because it was a bit challenging to like get it published and stuff. There's some like to how to make it actually go online, because it wasn't made with that in mind initially. But looking back, it would be nice to like have started using something like the Google or Amazon services, so that deployment would be very easy.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Yngve. We'll have to move on. Unfortunately, I'll have to cut off my boss, so to speak. Joachim asked a question, but maybe you can continue that in the chat after the session. All right, so then let's think. All right, thanks. Sorry for the getting ahead of myself here. The second presentation will be given by Christian van Onzenoodt from Ulm University, and go ahead.
My name is Christian, and in this talk I would like to present the results of our paper on the perceptual influence of shape overlap on data comparison using scatterplots. First, we would like to talk about our motivation. While research suggests that color is a rather dominant visual channel, other work could also show that shape encoding can be visually salient. There's a lot of literature on overlap in scatterplots and different techniques to deal with this overlap. When using shape-based encodings, however, overlap is usually avoided, for example by using synthetic datasets. Therefore, we would like to investigate the perceptual implications of overlap when using shape-based encodings in scatterplot. While approaching this question, we found a lack of a concrete measurement of overlap in scatterplots. We would like to start by introducing the overlap measurements. Let's start with the pixel-based overlap. Here we see a zoom-in of a stimuli as used in our studies. We can see triangles and asterisks. What we would like to measure using this method is the pixel-wise overlap between the shapes, here marked using the red pixels. Our method works based on the fact that we know how many and which shapes we need to draw. Here, for example, 3 triangles and 2 asterisks. We also know how many pixels each of these shapes draw. By using the number of pixels which is supposed to be drawn and the actual number of pixels which are drawn, we can now compute the number of overdrawn pixels. Second, we have the bounding circle-based method. Let's take the following example using the plus and the asterisk symbol. We can now simply create bounding circles by using the size of the shapes and count the number of overlaps. Finally, we can now normalize the value by using the number of possible overlaps. As you might have noticed, the bounding circle method does not take into account how much the actual shapes are overlap. The relative bounding circle overlap metric does take this into account. Here, we simply use all combinations of shapes and compute the amount of overlap between each of the pairs. The final metric is then computed by using the mean of all the overlaps. As a last metric, we propose a shape-based overlap metric. For this, we consider the individual combination of shapes and their position relative to each other. To compute this, we used every shape as used in our studies and ran every other shape as an occluder as shown in this simplified visualization using this animation. By doing so, we find the overlap between the shapes for each relative position, and we are able to find the maximum possible overlap. This can then be used to compute a normalized overlap value for each constellation of shapes. Here we can see an example of shape overlaps as appeared in our studies, using all our metrics. Here you can see advantages for the individual methods. To explain these advantages, I would like to point out individual values. Let's start with the bounding circle overlap metric. Obviously, we are measuring overlap for all shown examples. However, as you can see, the plus-cross combination in the center does not actually overlap. The shape-based version does take this into account, as well as the pixel-based version. So the question would be, why do we even need the bounding circle method? We argue that while this simple approach shows these downsides, it is really easy to compute without the need of rendering concrete shapes. During our experiments, our goal was to find if this simplification could still serve as a predictor to model human perception. As a trade-off between the two pixel-accurate metrics and the bounding circle method, we propose a relative bounding circle overlap as shown in this row. After presenting our metrics, we would now like to present our methods. In our experiments, we used 6 different shapes adopted from related work. These shapes are circles, squares, triangles, plus, cross, and asterisk. These shapes can be divided into 2 groups as identified in the work by Burlinson and others. Circles, squares, and triangles are considered closed shapes, while the plus, cross, and the asterisk are open shapes. We use 2 different sizes of shapes, 7 and 15 pixels. We selected 3 different tasks focused on the comparison between 2 classes from a task definition established by previous work. These tasks are comparing the number of shapes. In this task, participants were asked to decide which class has more points, so which shape appears more often. Comparing the variance. In this task, we presented 2 classes of points and the participants were asked which of them shows the smaller variance, so which of the points are more cluttered. And finally, comparing the average value. Here, participants were asked which of the 2 sets of shapes has a higher average value on the y-axis. This task was mainly used because, in contrast to the first two, this task involved visual aggregation. So observers need to compute the aggregation properties over a collection of points. This experimental setup was then divided into 6 separate experiments based on shape size and task. So there was one experiment for the number of shapes task using the small shape sizes, one for the number of tasks using the big shape sizes, and so on. For these experiments, we generated a broad set of stimuli. For the number of shapes task, we used all 6 of our shapes in combination with all other shapes as a distractor. To generate different amounts of overlap, we used 3 different levels of variance. We used 3 levels of difficulty and repeated each of these settings 3 times using different seeds to generate a total of 810 stimuli. For the variance task, we used a similar setup to generate 270 stimuli, as well as for the average value task to generate a total of 540 stimuli. Each of these experiments followed the same procedure. Participants had to fill a demographic questionnaire before getting an introduction into the stimuli and the task. Afterwards, participants completed some practice trials. As in the actual study, these practice trials followed the same setup. First, participants were presented with a fixation screen for a random time between 500 milliseconds and 1 second. This fixation screen shows a black plus in the center as shown here. Then the actual stimulus was presented as shown here. Participants were then able to respond to the task by using the F or J key. Once the participant finished the practice trials, the actual study started. As already mentioned, we ran 6 experiments. Here we see an overview of the number of participants as involved in our experiments. Let's look at some more examples from the study. Here we can see a comparison of the different shape sizes as used in our experiments. These examples are taken from our comparing number of shapes task. For both of the examples, the circle is the target shape, while the cross is the distractor. Here we see examples from the number of shapes task. We see examples from the different difficulty levels. Each of the stimuli shows 100 shapes. For the easy task, we have 68 circles and 32 pluses. The medium task shows 63 circles and 37 pluses, while the hard task shows 58 circles and 42 pluses. Here we see examples of stimuli used in our variance task. For all examples, asterisk is the target while plus is the distractor. The example on the left shows an example where the target shape uses the large variance and the distractor shape uses a medium variance. The example in the center shows a large variance for the target shape and a small variance for the distractor, while the example on the right uses our medium variance for the target and the small variance for the distractor. Finally, we see examples used in our experiments of the average task. For all plots, triangles are the target shape, while the asterisk was used as the distractor. Task difficulty was varied using different distances between averages called delta, reaching from 8 to 80 pixels. Now we would like to present the results of our evaluation. First, we would like to show the effect of shapes in our experiments. Here we see the combined results from both experiments using big and small shapes involved in the number of shapes task. As you can see, there are combinations of shapes which are more prone to overlap than others. While using the triangle as a target and the asterisk as a distractor, for example, the accuracy is decreasing drastically with an increasing amount of overlap, as indicated here with the orange line. In contrast, the red line visualizing the results of the combination of circle as a target and cross as a distractor. We see similar effects on other combinations, and we also found similar effects as in related work, where combinations of closed shapes as a target and open shapes as a distractor show generally high accuracies. In the variance task, we don't see the same strong decrease for certain combinations of shapes as we saw in the number of shapes task. However, we found combinations of shapes as, for example, the plus and the cross, or the cross and the asterisk, which shows poor performance. Finally, in the experiment involving the average value task, we found a similar pattern as with the number of shapes experiment. We have combinations as, for example, the circle and the plus symbol, which do not suffer that strong from overlap, as indicated here with the blue line. On the other hand, we see the orange line, which is presenting the results of the combination of the triangle and the cross. We can see that this combination suffers really strong from an increasing amount of overlap. Again, we found that the combination of open and closed shapes seemed to work really well. Here we see an overview of the results from all our experiments. We see all combinations of shapes on the y-axis ordered by accuracy for all tasks combined, while the x-axis shows the accuracy. The first column shows the combined results, while the remaining present the results of the individual tasks. We colored the bar for the combination with the highest accuracy for each condition in green, and the combination with the lowest accuracy in orange. As we can see, indicated by these green bars, the combination of the circle and the plus symbol showed the highest overall accuracy for the count task as well as for the average value task. For the variance task, however, we found the combination of asterisk and square to show the highest accuracy. We also found combinations of shapes which show low accuracies for all tasks, as example the combination of the square and the triangle. This was the worst combination for the counting task as well as for the average task, and when combining all results, as seen with the orange bars. An interesting outlier is the variance task. As indicated using the green bar in the third column, the combination of asterisk and square showed the highest accuracy. We used a regression model to compare the predictive performance of our metrics. In this model, we used target and distractor shape, number of shapes, sizes of shapes, variance, mean, and the individual overlap metric as an independent variable. We then compared the created models using the likelihood ratio test and the Wong closest test to compare their fit to the data. Here we found that the shape-based metric showed the best fit to the data, indicating that this metric should be preferred over the other simpler metrics. As direct implications for scatterplot design, we would like to conclude with the following two takeaways. We recommend the following combinations of shapes when using a shape-based encoding in scatterplots: circle as a target and either plus or cross as a distractor, or triangle as target and plus as a distractor. We did build this overview chart as a summary of our findings. We see all combinations of target and distractor shapes for each task. From this we can see the mentioned combinations of open and closed shapes to show good results, as well as the interesting effect for the variance task as mentioned earlier. When trying to measure overlap in shape-based scatterplots, we would recommend to use the shape-based metric. Where we already ran a large-scale user study, there are still some opportunities for future work. The first thing would be more complex scatterplots, as for example including more than 3 shapes. Color would not only draw the attention to certain shapes, but also introduce the effect of the drawing order of shapes to become important. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Christian, for this very interesting presentation. Reminder to everyone, please ask your questions in the respective chats so that we can see them. But for the time being, I'll start with 1 or 2 of my own. in your experiment, did you pay attention to actually position the marks on a pixel-precise raster so that you actually had this kind of pixel-wise overlap, or did you have that like free-floating and floating point position so that you would deal with grayscale? And would that have an effect essentially?
Actually, we did take care of that so that they are aligned and we don't have to deal with a lot of aliasing artifacts and stuff like that. But I think in practice you wouldn't really notice it, I would say. Like if you have a high DPI screen as we usually have, I don't think that this would be an issue.
Okay, thanks. And a second question that I would have is, you had a number of these metrics that you came up with based on the overlaps and stuff, and then you did the experiment, and then you compared the individual metrics to the results of the experiment. But would it be possible to like look at all your different overlap metrics and find some sort of a weighted metric based on these that better predicts what you actually observed in the perceptual experiment?
Yes, actually, that we tried to experiment with that, but we didn't come up with a really good way of doing it, and something which that significantly improved the predictive performance. But yeah, in practice, this is something you could really do. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay, there's one question here. Thomas Alves asks, did you measure the visual acuity of the participants to test whether it had an effect?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the word acuity. What does it mean?
I think how well people can actually read the visualizations.
No, this was done as an online experiment, so we had no influence on how users actually perceived that, if they wore glasses or something like that. So we couldn't really do that. Yeah, but as usually do in such a large scale user study, you hope that a big number of participants does smooth out that noise in the data, I would say. Yeah.
Thomas asks a follow-up question. Do you think that cognitive traits such as visual or working memory would affect the results?
I could think so. Yeah, it could be possible, but it's not something that we investigated in this. There's a recent paper I did read, which from WIS, I think, which did something in the working memory directory in that case. But in our work, we didn't do that. But yeah, it definitely could play a role, I think, let's say. Yeah.
And a final question from Chet Steed. Great work. Is there a cutoff in the number of marks the metrics work for? This could be a more general question on how many marks are digestible in a scatter plot of this type.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, totally. If you go with a large number of points, you get that many overlap that you can't really see anything anymore. So that is basically your upper limit. But yeah, it's limited, I would say, to basically use such a shape-based encoding. You can't make them infinitely small. You can't make them infinitely big. So that's also some reason why we chose certain visual parameters in our studies. And it's the same for the number of shapes. I think the number of shapes, the marker size, and the canvas size is something which you have to have in the right correlation or relation to each other, let's say. Yeah.
All right, thanks a lot. So thanks to Christian for his great presentation and questions or answers. All right, now for our third presentation, in which Chet Steed will introduce their system CrossVis. Go ahead.
In this talk, I will provide an overview of the CrossVis visual analytics system based on our paper in graphics and visual computing entitled CrossVis, a visual analytics system for exploring heterogeneous multivariate data with applications to materials and climate science. I'll provide an overview of the original paper focusing on several particular points. For more details about CrossVis, we recommend reading the original open access paper in graphics and visual computing. There are four main contributions discussed in the current CrossVis paper. CrossVis adds new visual representations of numerical, categorical, temporal, image, and bivariate parallel coordinate axes that, when combined with linked supplemental visualizations and interactive query methods, reveal trends and patterns in heterogeneous multivariate data. The paper also describes several functional design considerations related to the visual representations, including a discussion of some alternate designs. An overview of CrossVis is provided in the paper, which describes the integration of several parallel coordinate extensions into a comprehensive system. And finally, the paper presents feedback from domain experts following their application of CrossVis to practical scientific data analysis scenarios. CrossVis is comprised of a main visualization panel that is supplemented by other linked views. The main visualization panel is an extension of the parallel coordinate technique. It features a unique combination of axis representations and embedded visualizations of statistical information, in addition to detailed table views, which is shown below. The main panel is augmented by a correlation matrix, interactive scatterplots, and image-based visualization. These supplemental views are linked to the main visualization panel and controlled by a scalable tabular data model that lies behind the scenes. I will now describe most of these features in more detail. Most parallel coordinate plots support numerical axes, and CrossVis follows suit in that regard. However, a number of enhancements are added to CrossVis for numerical axes. In the interior of these axes, summary statistics are represented by a line and box representing the median and interquantile range, respectively. In the left figure shown in the slide, the y-axis shows the overall median and interquantile representation for all values. Smaller summary graphics are shown in the lat axis. These are smaller box plots that represent for the selection. The blue box plot represents the selected summary statistics, and then the gray smaller box plot represents the unselected summary statistics. The user can turn on the display of histograms on the numerical axes for more granular information about the distribution, which is shown in the y-axis and the lat axis. When selections are set, such as the yellow numerical range selection shown on the y-axis, the selected portion of each histogram bin is shaded blue in the figure. A correlation indicator is shown below the axes. When an axis is selected, the correlations are shown for each axis with the selected axis. Otherwise, the correlations are shown between neighboring axes. Scatterplots are also shown below the correlation indicators. The scatterplots are linked to selections in the parallel coordinate plot and provide a redundant encoding of pairwise trends that's better for showing things like nonlinear relationships. The figure on the right shows the zooming capabilities for numerical axes. From left to right, that figure shows the progression of a zoom operation into a smaller range of values for the lat axis. Each numerical axis has an upper and a lower context, which is called out in the figure, with the middle being the focus region. The user can adjust the focus min-max limits to effectively zoom into the axis. This zooming feature is helpful when dense clusters of lines make it hard to see the structure of the line crossings. CrossVis also supports temporal axes, as shown on the left in this figure. Behind the scenes, full date objects are stored for the date values. A histogram is also shown on the temporal axis, but it is shown inside the axis instead of on the outside to save space. In the middle, we see the categorical axis representation. Each category is represented by a rectangle inside the axis. The category rectangles encode the counts for each category in the proportional height mode. In the equal height mode, each category rectangle is the same height, evenly divided based on the axis, total axis height. When selections are made, the portions of each category that are being selected by the query are shown in blue. Both temporal and categorical axes support scatterplot axes below the parallel coordinate plot. The final axis representation is shown on the right. It provides support for images, where an image is associated with a polyline or row tuple in the data model. The interior of the axis has tick marks for representing each image. When the user hovers over a mark, a thumbnail of the associated image is shown, as shown in the figure. The user can drag a box to select a group of images, or the user can click on individual ticks to select single images. All axes supports the standard capability to rearrange their configuration inside the parallel coordinate plot. If a user drags and drops an axis on top of another axis, a two-dimensional scatter plot between those two axes are shown. Here we can see a scatter plot for lat and lon. The scatter plot is larger than those shown below the parallel coordinate axes, and the scatter plot is directly embedded in the parallel coordinate plot for easier connections to the range queries and the associated lines. CrossVis also supports more detailed views when image data are present. The tiled image panel is available as shown on the left of this figure. Images that correspond to selected lines are haloed with the current selected line color, and these are shown first in the order. Unselected images are shown below the selected images. On the right of this figure, we see a detailed image view, which can be opened by clicking on an image in the tile view. The user can zoom and pan in the detailed image view. I will now hit the high points on one use case presented in the full paper. Scientists at Oak Ridge National Laboratory Center for Nanophase Material Science used CrossVis to interpret and improve a neural network-based image classification process for images of diatoms that were produced by a scanning electron microscope. The neural network was used to predict whether the images correspond to genetically modified, which are encoded as modified, or non-modified, which are encoded as wild, diatoms. The goal was to understand which features were most important to the prediction and help the scientists gain trust in the process. Here is one parallel coordinate plot of the diatom data. Here a line corresponds to one of the diatom images, which is shown on the far left axis. We've selected all images that were classified as modified by the neural network, as you can see on the type axis. In the paper, analysis using the image view is described, but for the sake of time, we will focus here on the more quantitative insights revealed by the parallel coordinates plot. The interquantile range rectangles are box plots for the poor mean area and expected Gaussian value axes, and the poor density axes show the most separation between the two image categories. We can see this by looking at the smaller box plots for each of these axes. This suggests that these are the most distinguishing features. There's a strong positive correlation between poor mean area and expected Gaussian. The R value is about 0.97. We can see it in the plot by the mostly horizontal lines between these two axes. This suggests that one of these two variables can be removed since together they're not adding much total value to the overall model. Poor mean area has less overlap between the two categories, as we can see through the smaller box plots on that plot. So we might want to keep that one over expected Gaussian. In this figure, the modified category selection on the type axis shown in the previous slide is removed, and a range selection is set for the upper range of the poor mean area axis. That is, for values greater than the median. This selection captures 29 of the 59 total images, most of which are in the modified category. However, some modified images are excluded and some wild images are included, which shows a single dimension is not ideal for classifying the images. It is truly a multivariate classification problem. The tooltip that is being displayed shows 7 of 29 wild images are selected. The tooltip for the modified category, which is not shown, shows 22 of 29 images are selected. This finding confirms the significance of pore size and density, and it reinforces the importance of a multivariate process. As the material scientists who led this analysis stated, such information suggests that not every single diatom in the modified set underwent genetic modification, which is clearly revealed using CrossVis. In this figure, we selected 2 severe outliers on the variance axis. These images are also outliers on some of the other axes. The ability to see the images helped the scientists see that the modified images had a wider range of pixel variance in general. Parallel coordinates excels at showing such outliers. Another use case and further discussion of results are presented in the paper, and we again encourage the audience to read the full paper. CrossVis is arguably one of the most comprehensive parallel coordinate tools available, given its support for several different data types and interactive queries in a single system. In our use cases, we show how CrossVis helped scientists explain AI results and explore complex data sets for validation and verification purposes. For the diatom use case, CrossVis helped the scientists gain trust in the process and improve their results. The scientists told us that CrossVis helped them to think in a more multivariate manner about the data, which was a big leap from their prior focus on 2 or 3 dimensions separately. We designed CrossVis in close collaboration with domain experts who used the tool in practical scientific investigation. Since the paper was written, CrossVis has been applied to financial data, health data, cybersecurity data, and other data sets with favorable results. Furthermore, we have re-implemented the tool as an online web application. Thank you for your time to hear about our paper and CrossVis.
Thanks, Chad, for this very nice introduction to your CrossVis tool. And again, everyone, if you have questions, please type the questions in the chat so that we can see them and ask them here. I'll start with one of my own. The tool that you presented, CrossVis, seems very elaborate and very feature complete in a way. How did you go about the design? Did you have a specific application in mind or a specific application domain in mind, or was the intent more to develop a general tool? So what kind of development process did you follow there?
Yeah, it started out more as a general application, but we kind of connected with the scientists at CNMS, and it was more of a participatory design in that case. We were always the computer science side of it. We were thinking about the more general case. Of course, they were thinking about the more specific, but I think, we worked together to get something that, provided value for both. And since then, we've applied it to other things like cybersecurity and other multivariate data sets. I think their use case involving the images made it much more specific in that sense. So We haven't
That's what
used the image capability for anything else.
That's what struck me also, that this inclusion of images is rather unique in a way. And maybe related to that, how much effort does it take to prepare a new data set for the tool if you have such special data features such as images?
It reads a CSV file and it expects and then after you load in the CSV, you can load in the images separately. It just expects the ordering to kind of follow the rows in the CSV.
I see.
So it's not terribly elaborate in that sense, but you do kind of have to follow the same row IDs. But after that, there's a lot more I think that could be done on the image side. We only scratched the surface. There's a lot more reordering and maybe even including image techniques that others may want to pursue.
Very nice. I find that very fascinating that you have that included and that it works so well. Maybe a final question, because I don't see anyone asking anything in the chat. For a new user to learn the tool, is that very complicated, or is it just basically a matter of 10 minutes or so?
To train new users?
To train new users on the system, yeah. How to use it, all the features.
I found parallel coordinates is like a mixed bag. Some people seem to get it, some don't. I think we had an advantage of they were part of the design process, and that's kind of like something that I would suggest if you include people on any kind of advanced information viz technique. But most of the time it's either they get it or they don't. And I think that even in that case, people have to start using the interactive capabilities of it before they truly understand it. But after they make a few range queries and stuff, I noticed that most people kind of get it.
Right. Cool. Thanks a lot. I don't see any other questions. So if anybody has questions later on, just keep asking the chat and connect to chat after the session. So thanks for that presentation.
Thank you.
All right, that gets us to our fourth talk, which will be given by Martin Imre on spectrum preserving sparsification for visualization of big graphs. Go ahead.
Welcome to the presentation of spectrum preserving graphs for visualization of big graphs. This was a work in the Computer and Graphics Journal, and it was done during my time as a PhD student at the University of Notre Dame. Together with Jim Tao, who is now professor in Guangzhou, and some collaborators from Michigan Tech University. Today I first will talk about graph specification and simplification, followed by our SPS framework that contains the SES and MNR algorithm. Further, I will point out the differences between graph reduction and graph sampling, and then show some results, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So first of all, why do we do graph specification? Well, many problems can be modeled as a graph, and as data grows, we result in larger graphs. And usually algorithms cannot cope with ever-growing graph sizes or data sizes in that matter. So not only that, but also the visual analysis is rather cumbersome. For example, look at the bottom, you can see on the left a rather dense graph, and then on the right it's sparsened out, so you can see the clusters much better, albeit with the coloring that helps already. And lastly, that simpler graph makes it just easier for a human to do the analysis. And if we keep the important components, for example, in our case, we have spectral analysis, that is even better. So first of all, what were previous techniques? There was the deterministic spectral sparsification by Eads et al. And they basically compute the pseudo-inverse of the Laplacian matrix and then pick edges with the largest effective resistance. Then there was another method for graph sampling, is the forest file method, where we start at a random node and burn edges at random recursively. And for our approach, We use two different implementations of that. One that goes on until it reaches a target node number, and one until it reaches a target number of edges. And lastly, there's also METIS, which we compare to, which is a multi-level graph partitioning scheme, kind of similar to a clustering, and we just combined that as a reduction method. So how does our framework work? Well, we start with an input graph, and first we run through a spectral edge sparsification. One thing to note is that the spectrum of a graph refers to the eigenvalues and eigenvectors and their characteristics of the adjacency and Laplacian matrix of the graph. Then, after the spectral edge sparsification, we do a multi-level node reduction, followed by an eigenvector computation, which allows us to generate a layout and do some spectral clustering. Next, we do some multi-level eigensolver to map back those eigenvalues from the lowest level, and then we can draw a graph. And as you can see on the bottom, this basically generates a graph for us at different sparsification levels. There's first of all the edge sparsification. So how do we do the spectral edge sparsification? First, a low stretch spanning tree is created, followed by the embedding of the critical, the spectral embedding and the critical ranking of off-tree edges. Next, a subgraph. The subgraph itself is densified by adding back those off-tree edges that are critical spectra. And next and lastly, the subgraph edges are scaled using stochastic gradient descent optimization to achieve the correct level or the correct size of the eigenvectors and eigenvalues. Then the multi-level node reduction basically merges nodes together based on the eigensolver that keeps the properties and the spectrum of the graph stable, and later maps that back to, or basically on the lowest level we then compute the eigenvectors and map those back and do some smoothing too for the more dense levels. So one thing to note is that SPS, so our method as well as METIS, is more like can be seen as a clustering that merges nodes together on every level, whereas graph sampling methods like DSS or the forest file method are just sampling, so they pick nodes and leave the other nodes out. This will be important when it comes to the quantitative evaluation. And speaking of the evaluation, here are the data sets that we've used. They are from very different areas, for example, social networks or computational fluid dynamics, geographic networks, and they have a wide variety of different node and edge combination in terms of the numbers. We start with very small ones with just a couple thousand nodes and a couple thousand edges, but we go up to hundreds of thousands of nodes and multiple million edges. So first of all, we look at the time. And obviously nobody likes to look at a slide that is just a table, right? So don't worry about the details of this slide, but the most important thing is that the SPS is always dominated by the spectral edge sparsification. However, this algorithm scales very well and everything else stays rather stable and is very quick. And what we can see is that this means for the smaller graphs, the forest file method is typically faster. However, for the bigger graph, there is just no comparison to the SPS anymore. It's just two different worlds. And the DSS is rather only works for the small graphs because it just runs out of memory for the bigger graphs, and it's rather slow because it needs to compute the whole pseudo-inverse of the Laplacian. So it wouldn't be the EuroVis if it wasn't also about graph drawing, right? So how do we draw the graphs? Well, first of all, we picked a couple layouts that we used, and the first is the eigenvector layout, or eigen, how we termed it for short. And basically we just used the two leading eigenvectors as the x and y coordinates. Then we use the t-stochastic neighborhood embedding, t-distributed stochastic neighborhood embedding, or short t-SNE, and reduced the 50 leading eigenvectors to 2, which we then used as the x and y coordinate. Lastly, we also used the force-directed layout with the fast multi-level method and combined, and for all of those drawings, we just used some edge bundling to reduce visual clutter. So here are some visual results, and as you can see already, they differ quite a lot. In the top, we see on the left the FM3 drawings for the sparsest level of the Illinois 2010 datasets, which is a geographical layout based on the census blocks in Illinois in, you guessed it, 2010. And we can see that our method somewhat resembles the shape of Illinois, even though we went through 5 levels of sparsification, whereas the forest fire method, well, it looks like a spanning tree. On the right side in the top, we can see the USPS 10 nearest neighbor graph, which displays the nearest neighbor of handwritten digit recognitions. And in the eigen layout here, we use just the 2 dominated eigenvectors. We can see in the SPS that there are 3 very distinct clusters with some blurring in between. And if we think about this, most likely for handwritten digit recognitions, there are those very round digits like 0 and 8, for example. Then there are those semi-round ones with like 2 and 6 and 9. And then there is like the very pointy ones like 7 and 1. And most likely these 3 clusters correspond to that. However, in the forest fire result, we cannot really see that because it's so much stretched out that it's just impossible to see. And on the bottom, we can see the CFD, which is a computational fluid dynamics problem. And we can see the graph after sparsification in 3 different levels, so level 1, 3, and 5, and both for METIS and SPS, all drawn in a T-SNE layout. While both of them look very pleasing and aesthetically, especially aesthetically pleasing, I would argue that the SPS keeps the same structure, whereas METIS kind of changes in structure on every level. So how did we do the quantitative comparison? Well, we used the proxy quality metrics introduced by Nguyen and al., which basically uses the original graph and then the drawing of a sample graph and compares a somewhat neighborhood graph, like a nearest neighbor graph, for example. One important thing to note is there is a one-to-one correspondence used during that comparison, which means we can only do this before the spectral edge classification. Furthermore, we used 4 graph quality metrics and computed them for the sample graph, so for the sparsest level, or for the level of the sample we used, and the original graph. And basically these metrics give a score for every node. And then for each of those, we just assume that these scores, or we pretend that these scores are drawn from a random distribution. And we use the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test to compare how well those 2 distributions align. And this basically then gives us the result, how well the sampled graph is compared to the original one. So the proxy quality metrics, here everything above 1 favors SPS. And as you can see, in general, SPS performs very well and is generally better. There are some outliers as usual. And for this example, it's both for the airfoil and the USPN 10, and there the FM3 layout seems to favor the forest fire method. Also, the forest fire seems to be okay for the small graphs. However, it performs rather bad when the graphs get bigger. And lastly, here we can see the results of the KS test of the 4 different graph quality metrics. We can, first of all, to note, lower is better because a score of 0 means it's the same distribution and a score of 1 means they're from different distributions. And what we can see here is that the SPS method is generally better than any of the forest fire methods. and also usually outperforms the DSS. But it kind of, or not but one thing we found is that METIS and SPS perform rather similar, especially when looking at the trends, which kind of shows that they are both using a similar approach of doing a graph reduction rather than a graph sampling. And these trends especially can show how it would go further for more levels, which would definitely be interesting to investigate further. And one more thing to note is that we both plotted here the SPS after the just after the spectral. So basically there are two SPS here, and one compares to the one after the edge sparsification and one compares to the original graph, because there's a big difference in the two, since one compares to a spanning tree and the other one compares to the normal graph, which makes a big difference, especially when it comes to the cluster, the closeness centrality. And with that being said, to sum up, basically I talked about graph sparsification and simplification, the SPS framework and its two core algorithms, the SES and the MNR. Then I quickly pointed out the differences between graph reduction and graph sampling and showed results both quantitatively and qualitatively. And without further ado, I want to thank everyone for listening to this recorded talk. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Martin, for this great presentation. To everyone, if you have questions, please ask them in the chat and let me know if you have them, and then I can ask them. In the meantime, one question of myself, the sparsification that you talked about makes a lot of sense if you have to look at big data sets on a global scale for global analysis. But what happens if you also have to look at some aspects of them or some parts of them in more detail? Have you explored some way of, first of all, indicating that there's detail missing? And second, how you can interactively maybe transition to a more detailed view?
Yes, we have. We have actually, in our original approach, we had a focus plus context visualization where you mouse over the graph, and the areas where your mouse is just are shown in a denser state. But this was not at a paper-ready state, I would say, by the time we submitted this paper originally, so this was not added in there.
Okay.
But that would be one way to do that too. Basically, since we have multiple levels, we could use this focus plus context, or just a simple click on a certain area and then show this area in a more context there.
I would also envision maybe something that does a gradual transition. So in that case, you would have to select which of the elements that you have taken out to put back in which order. Maybe that's something to think about as well. Okay, one other question maybe, because I don't really see any questions yet in my chat here. What's the relationship of your approach to other abstraction techniques for spatial data? So for example, there's progressive meshes, there is edge bundling, there are graph contraction schemes for brain connectivity visualization. How does that relate? Have you compared them in some way?
No, we have not. So basically the comparison we did, that's all I showed in the presentation. We compared to other graph-centric methods and not to other general visual simplification methods, or as you just mentioned.
But I could envision, for example, that progressive meshes could be something that you could compare to, because that could be applied to graphs just as well. Edge bundling doesn't really remove anything, but just moves it close together, just as with the contraction techniques. But anything that would be interesting, I guess, for comparing. So I don't see any other questions yet. In that case, let's thank Martin a lot for his presentation.
Yeah.
All right, and last but certainly not least, we come to the last presentation of this session, which will be given by Jacob Hauenstein on descriptions and evaluations of methods for determining surface curvature in volumetric data. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jacob Hauenstein. I'm going to be presenting a work on determination of surface curvature in volumetric data. I did this work with a colleague of mine at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, Dr. Timothy Newman. This work appeared in volume 86, the February 2020 volume of Computers and Graphics.
For the organization, since the paper is about surface curvature, the first thing we'll talk about is the basics of surface curvature. Following that, we'll go over an overview of the contributions of the paper. Then we'll talk about the existing methods that are discussed in the paper, the new methods that are introduced in the paper, and then the experiments and results. For the basics of surface curvature is, in essence, just a useful shape descriptor. It is both translation and rotation invariant, which makes it, of course, useful for lots of tasks. Our interest here is in specifically the principal curvature measures denoted kappa sub 1 and kappa sub 2. So there's lots of different curvature measures. You may have heard of Gaussian curvature and so on and so forth. Here our focus is on the two principal curvatures, kappa sub 1 and kappa sub 2. These curvatures have found to be useful in a number of different tasks, including direct volume rendering, segmentation, registration, medical assessment, and so forth. Essentially, anywhere where it might be useful to have a descriptor that describes the shape, curvature may be useful. Curvature to compute requires the first and second derivatives, and this makes it potentially difficult to compute curvature on discrete or real data. So, as a result, there are many competing methods to determine curvature on real data. Often the approach that's used is to estimate derivatives from the discrete real data, and no one of those methods can be said to be best. That is, there's no one method that always performs the most accurately. Our focus in this work is on surface curvature determination in volumes. We introduced two new surface curvature determination methods, including a third method that's a variant of one of these two. We also introduce a number of studies on both these new and existing methods. These studies consider a variety of data, both synthetic data with and without noise, and real data, including like from PET and CT scanners. These studies consider the accuracy of each method when operating on these types of data, and also the ability of these methods to produce a quality direct volume rendering using curvature-based transfer functions. One such rendering is shown over at the right, at the top with the curvatures off by 10%, and at the bottom using the exact correct curvatures, and you can see the top rendering is of much worse quality. These studies also consider the runtime of each of these methods. So I'll talk first about all the existing methods that are included in the studies I just talked about on the previous slide. For each of these methods, you'll see a bold, shortened, abbreviated version of that method name, and those will be referred to later when the results are presented. Many of the existing methods that are considered are convolution-based. All of these convolution-based methods work essentially on the same principle, which is use convolution to estimate derivatives and then compute curvature from those estimated derivatives. These methods differ in the convolution filters or convolution kernels that are used, and there are some other intermediate processing steps that distinguish them as well. I don't have time to go over those details here, unfortunately. They're all covered in the journal paper. So the first method, denoted TE, it estimates derivatives using filters from the Taylor expansion. The two GST, gradient structure tensor-based methods, GSTI and GSTH, both estimate the gradient structure tensor, which is computed from the derivatives, and those derivatives are estimated using Gaussian filters. DF, the Dirichlet filter approach, estimates derivatives using Dirichlet filters. There are also two spline-based methods that are considered, BS, which estimates derivatives by forming a trivariate B-spline of the data, and CRS, which estimates derivatives by forming a trivariate Catmull-Rom spline. There is also a method considered that uses sort of its own approach, called PCR.
it reduces the problem of finding surface curvature within the volume to the problem of finding a number of planar curvatures, thus PCR planar curvature reduction. For the two new methods that are introduced, unfortunately I don't have time to go into all the intimate details about them. Those are, of course, in the journal paper, though. But I will say one is convolution-based, denoted OP. It estimates derivatives using filters that are sampled from orthogonal polynomials. Convolution with those orthogonal polynomials implicitly performs a linear regression, so it's essentially related to a linear regression-based approach. The other new approach is in the other category. It's denoted DN. It estimates curvatures using within a region computing the difference of normals. So it doesn't explicitly compute second derivative quantities. It computes a difference of normals within a region. So now that we've talked about the existing and new methods that are considered in the work, let's get into some details about the experiments and the results. So first we'll talk about the experiments to evaluate the synthetic data accuracy for each of the existing and new methods. To do this, the work considers a number of different synthetic data sets, both with and without noise. In this presentation, we'll just look at a couple of them because I don't have time to look at more, but there's more in the paper. One we'll look at in this presentation is called spheres, because if you were to look at the isosurfaces of the data set, it would just consist of a number of spheres, one of which is rendered in that middle rendering there, the rendering near in the middle of the screen. That is a isosurface with an ISO value of 0.25 with the dataset scaled as described in the paper. The right rendering is a isosurface of the genus 3 dataset because it is a genus 3 surface. So that is an isosurface of ISO value 0. Both of these are generated from polynomial functions, but the spheres polynomial is just quadratic, whereas genus 3 is a higher degree polynomial. So we can see here plots showing the amount of error exhibited by each method on the genus 3 and spheres dataset. Here, the bars show the amount of error in kappa sub 1 and kappa sub 2 for the genus 3 dataset, whereas the line shows the amount of error in kappa sub 1 for the spheres dataset. So for the spheres dataset, the two principal curvatures are equal everywhere, and so the amount of error in each one tends to be equal as well. So one thing you may notice is that PCR does not have results for everything here, and the reason is that PCR failed to produce results for the noise-added spheres or genus 3 datasets. However, it did produce results for the noise-free spheres dataset. So we can see from the blue bar on the left, when there is no noise in the spheres dataset, essentially a number of methods, including BS, OP, TE, and CRS, produce very, very low levels of error. And we can see on that same chart, but looking at the bars, we can see that TE and DF tend to produce about the least amount of error on the noise-free genus 3 alongside the BS and OP methods. Looking over on the right, we can see that the addition of noise, and there are additional noise levels and smoothing and other things considered in the paper that I don't have time here, but for this specific result, which is an unsmoothed noise-added result, we can see that OP, GSTI, and GSTH tend to do the best when noise is present for both the spheres and genus 3 datasets. Next, let's switch focus from synthetic data to real data. So this work considers also several different real datasets, that is, datasets acquired from, in this case, CT and PET scanners. So this illustration over here on the right shows part of a lung phantom. This was assembled by the United States FDA and then scanned. And this is a CT scan that includes, that we look at, a 40 millimeter ball on the left side of the scan and a 20 millimeter ball on the right side of the scan. And so since the shape and size of those objects is known, we went in and manually selected every point on the boundary of those objects, which you can actually see a little bit there in that screenshot over on the right. You can see the red boundary around the 40 millimeter ball. And we analyzed how accurately each method computed the curvature at each of those points. So for that left ball, that's denoted FDA-L in the results. The right one is FDA-R. The second CT was a commercially manufactured phantom. For that, we look at all the points on the boundary of an 8mm cylinder. That's denoted CATP. For the third one, it was not a CT scan, but instead a PET scan, also a phantom. It has a 22mm ball in it that we looked at the results of each method on the boundary of that ball. So what we see here are the results on those 4 different real data objects I talked about in the CAT scan, or in the commercially manufactured phantom, in the FDA manufactured, and the PET phantom. And with the legend there in the middle, referring to the charts, with the left one shows kappa sub 1 results, the right one shows kappa sub 2 results, we can see that the absolute error was lowest for the OP, GSTI, and GSTH methods, which were in fact the 3 that were lowest on our noise added plot a few slides back. So those 3 methods that performed best when we added noise to synthetic data also performed best on this real data. We also looked at results in this work, not just numeric results, but also results on one common curvature task, which is using curvature in direct volume rendering, DVR. So there have been several works published on using curvature-based transfer functions to essentially highlight shape in direct volume renderings. And so what we're going to talk about in this presentation, and there's more renderings in the paper, but what we're going to talk about here is a set of quadratic surfaces, a reference rendering for which is shown over there on the right. And you can see up above to the left of the rendering, that shows you the coloration that is expected to be seen. So essentially when kappa 2 and kappa 1 are both large, we expect a blue coloration. When kappa 2 and kappa 1 are negative or small, rather when they are negative, we should expect red, and when they're both near 0, we expect gray. And you can see that there, where you see the gray square is in fact flat, and then you see the blue one is convex, and the red one is concave. So this is a synthetic data set, and we, in the paper, look at what happens to the rendering quality when we use different methods to compute the curvature, to determine the curvatures, and at different noise levels. So we added a relatively small amount of noise, standard deviation 0.005, which is discussed in the paper, to that data set, and we can see that still many of the methods look like the reference rendering, though we can see varying amounts of noise present. So for example, at the top right we can see TE. It's still mostly blue for that top right part of the figure there, but we can see there's lots of sort of splotches where the curvature is not correct, and so the coloration varies. And we can see less of that, for example, in the OP rendering there, which is in the bottom row second from the left. We can see that it has some edge artifacts, particularly noticeable in the bottom left part of the rendering there. But in general, it doesn't exhibit too much of that sort of splotchiness that's characteristic of the noise. This is at a higher noise level, 10 times what the noise level was in the previous slide, and here we can see that there are now only 3 methods which resemble the correct rendering at all. And those are the OP, GSTH, and GSTI based renderings. So those are the renderings where the curvatures used for the coloration of the direct volume rendering were the curvatures provided by the OP, GSTH, and GSTI methods. And so this shouldn't be too surprising considering what we've seen in previous slides, which was that in real data and noisy data, those 3 methods seem to often perform among the most accurate. Our work also analyzes run times by looking at how long it takes each method to compute curvature at every point in a 256 cubed spheres dataset. For these tests, we ran all the methods on a Core i5 as described here with 16 gigabytes of RAM. The methods were all implemented in single-threaded C++ and compiled with G++ with the -02 optimization setting. And there's some other details in the paper about the operating system and how many runs we did and averaging and so on and so forth. So in these experiments, the method that took the least amount of time was the TE method, which took a little under 30 seconds. At the other end of the spectrum was the GSTI method, which took over 3,000 seconds, or about 50 minutes. And then in the middle was, for example, the new OP method, which took around 73 seconds, and the DF method, which took around 81 seconds. So in conclusion, the work introduced new determination methods for curvature and volumetric data. It compared those new methods with a number of existing methods. It compared them in the basis of accuracy, DVR rendering quality, and runtime. And very briefly, what was found is that the TE method tends to be quite good when no noise is present, both fast and accurate. But when noise is present, GSTI, GSTH, and OP tend to be better choices. Of those three, OP is the fastest. And there are, of course, lots more details in the paper.
Thanks a lot, Jacob, for this very nice presentation. Everyone ask questions in the chat so that you get a say in this as well, not just me. But for the time being, I'll start anyway. From what I understood, from the new methods that you introduced, the OP method was about similar in accuracy to the competition. So for example, the existing GSTI and GSTH methods. But these GSTI and GSTH methods are take a lot longer to compute. So your OP method, of course, was faster, which is great. What about the other method, the DN method, that didn't perform quite as good compared to the competition in accuracy? Does it have some niche applications where you could use it where it would beat the competition?
So I think the biggest advantage of the DN method is it avoids explicitly computing second derivatives. So there are scenarios where computationally, maybe you have first derivatives available already, and maybe computational time is limited. So there are certain scenarios where I believe essentially just using a different computational approach has some benefits. So that was sort of one of the reasons for including that DN method.
And would also be numerically more stable then, right?
So potentially it could be, yes, because we all know second derivatives have lots of numeric stability problems.
Joachim George asks, so should I use OP for real data then?
As was previously mentioned, the two GST-based methods produce similar accuracy. So my suggestion is if you have restrictions on your computational time, OP would probably be the best choice. However, in many cases, the GST methods are very slightly more accurate at the expense of a much longer computational time. So if accuracy is the utmost priority and you're not worried about time, I would recommend using one of the GST-based methods.
I see. Maybe one final question then. The new metrics, are you making them available? Are they kind of a plugin for ParaView or VTK or some library, open source code, something like that?
So I have a large library of methods I've implemented at this point. And so one of my long-term goals is to clean them up enough that I'm willing to show the code to others and open source them. So that's hopefully one day I'll get there. I keep telling myself I'll get there, but I haven't done it yet.
We'll be looking forward to that then. Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions, so thanks a lot, Jacob.
Sure, thanks.
Well, thanks a lot to all the speakers for participating in this special session. I'm really happy that this worked out and that we could pull this off for this year's EuroVis. For everybody who still has questions about these papers, please continue the discussion with all the presenters in the chat. They will be checking that. Also, I just want to remind you again that all the papers that you saw will be available for 6 months from Elsevier for free. So just follow the link in the EuroVis program and you will be able to download these papers. Also, I want to say that we would like to continue this special session in future years. So when you consider submitting your material to journals such as Computers and Graphics and the open access sister Graphics and Visual Computing, be aware that this ability exists. So there's no harm in going for the journal directly. You can have this option of presenting your work at a visualization-related conference as well. And with that, thanks then for listening. Thanks to all our speakers and presenters. and enjoy EuroVis.